Good morning and good evening to all. Distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the joint virtual sessions of the 5th Science Policy Forum for Biodiversity and the 8th International Conference on Sustainability Science, an event co-organized by 14 partner organizations and in collaboration with 9 contributing partners whose details are available on the event website at scienceforbiodiversity.org. My name is Claudio Chiarolla, and I'm the Program Management Officer responsible for technical and scientific cooperation at the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity. This one is the last virtual session in a series of 5. Today's agenda will comprise 2 main substantive parts, as well as a closing plenary. Part 1 is dedicated to and involves young scholars and professionals, and it will focus on ecological restoration, framing challenges and opportunities. Part 2 focuses on the SDG Lab's experiences, and it will present several biodiversity solutions for change. During the closing plenary, we will consider preliminary conclusions and recommendations of the virtual sessions which will be presented there. And we will also hear closing remarks by representatives of the co-organizing institutions. The usual housekeeping rules apply. So to submit your questions, please use the questions and answer tab at the bottom of your screen. The chat tab will be used only for housekeeping announcement. Attendees should not use the chat tab for submitting their questions to the panels. And at the end of the presentations, as many questions as possible will be selected for the Q&A round. However, since only a limited number of questions can be addressed during the live sessions, panelists may also respond in writing in the Zoom Q&A tab during the session. In addition, the unanswered questions, if any, will be reposted on the forum website. Such virtual space will remain open until Wednesday, 28th April, closure of business, to give an opportunity for the panelists and attendees to continue the online discussions. If you have already participated to previous session of this joint event, you should have already received via email the credential to access the virtual forum. If this is the first session that you attend, you should receive such credentials and instructions shortly after the session. Please contact us through the email that will be shared in the chat if you need any assistance. Now, I'm very delighted to hand over the floor to Professor Thomas Elmqvist, who will chair the Young Scholars and Professional session. He's professor in natural resource management at the Stockholm Resilience Center, Stockholm University. Thomas, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Claudio. And I also welcome everyone to this session. And I feel very excited about the set of young, enthusiastic speakers we will have for the next hour or 1 hour and a half or so. So the background to and the rationale for this session is not just the preparations for the COP15 that is coming up in October, but also the soon to be launched UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. So this was decided by the UN General Assembly and based on a proposal from more than 70 member states. And it's now decided this is going to be launched on the World Environment Day in June, so in less than 2 months. The UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration will try to build a strong, broad-based coalition of many different actors to ramp up restoration and put the world on a pathway for a more sustainable future. What is also interesting with this initiative is that there is quite a special emphasis put on the role of young scholars and professionals, and particularly from the global south. So we thought it was very timely to have a session during this Science and Policy Forum where we invite the young scholars and professionals to give their voice and reflection on ecological restoration and looking towards this decade, and to give their perspectives and to start a fruitful conversation on how young scholars and professionals could be involved. And we also know that the success of this UN initiative likely will very much depend on the enthusiasm, the knowledge, and all the practical work carried out by young scholars and professionals. So we will, during this next 1.5 hours, we will listen to 4 presentations giving from a global overview of restoration priorities to case studies. And we will also have a moderated discussion with 3 participants representing different perspectives on restoration in different types of habitats. But we will start, and I will welcome Catarina Jakovac at the Wageningen University, the International Institute for Sustainability and Conservation and Sustainability Science Center. So Catarina is a Brazilian ecologist and very much interested in forest regeneration and restoration in the Amazon and the Neotropics. And she has worked very much to bridge science and policy, particularly in the Amazon region. Rather recently, she was involved in a project with the aim to model priority areas for ecosystem restoration on a global scale. And I'm very happy that she's now going to present the result of that modeling exercise. So please, Catarina.
Thank you, Thomas. I'm pleased to be here to join you in this discussion and to contribute with our recent study on the global priority areas for ecosystem restoration. Since prehistorical times, humanity is deeply transforming the planet. Natural ecosystems have declined by 47%. Around 25% of species are already threatened with extinction. And not only biodiversity, but also climate is being affected by human actions. And we see unprecedentedly high CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere. Halting and reversing such crises, such impacts that we've caused to the planet requires ecosystem restoration. Several countries have signed agreements, international agreements for restoring ecosystems with very ambitious targets, and also aiming to limit global warming below 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees. To comply with all these agreements, we would need massive upscaling of restoration. We need funding, planning, and identifying where and how to restore these ecosystems. We know that costs and benefits vary across space. Therefore, spatial planning can increase the benefits and can reduce costs and conflicts. We know from experiences with prioritizing for conservation that scenario analysis can be a powerful tool to support planning and decision-making. So in this study, we aimed to identify where areas where benefits can be optimized and costs minimizing, aiming to increase the likelihood of restoration success. In this study, we used a multi-criteria approach for optimizing the outcomes of restoration of transformed landscapes. So those are the landscapes that have been converted to croplands and pasturelands, and restore them to their original ecosystems. So we predicted which ecosystem would be in those areas that have already been converted. We used 3 criteria. So to represent the benefits for biodiversity, we avoided species extinctions for more than 20,000 species. For benefits for climate change mitigation, this was represented by the amount of carbon that would be sequestered by the above ground and below ground biomass, and as well as the soil once restoration is taking place. And economical costs, which includes land opportunity costs and restoration costs. We used an approach, a linear programming approach, to identify the areas that would maximize the biodiversity and climate change mitigation benefits and reduce the costs. We created 1,200 scenarios. With this amount of scenarios, we are able to analyze trade-offs and synergies across costs and benefits, as well as across scales and geopolitical boundaries. So here I will show the results for the scenarios to restore 15% of converted lands, which is to comply with the IT target 15. So in the first set of scenarios, if we only maximize for environmental benefits, then, well, I don't have a pointer, but you have a whole, in this curve, you have a whole range for optimizing for biodiversity, and that you can see in the vertical axis, the biodiversity scenario would avoid extinctions of 62% of species. And in the other end, in the climate scenario, which it would be optimizing only for climate, you get in the horizontal axis, 320 gigatons of CO2 being sequestered. And along this curve, we find also an optimal solution for both, for optimizing biodiversity and climate, and getting 95% of the maximum possible attained biodiversity benefit and 90% of the maximum possible attained climate benefits. Restoring in these areas to get such benefits will imply in rather high costs of restoration per hectare. Including costs in this equation would mean 27% reduction in cost. So the bar colors, the colors in the bar represent the costs. So the blue ones are cheaper than the red or yellow ones. So this new scenario with costs reduce considerably the cost, but it still can get quite a good benefit for biodiversity and climate. And just to exemplify, if we had only focused on cost, so let's say we don't care about biodiversity and climate, only about restoring cheaply, we get this scenario down here to the left, which is very cheap, but very poor in terms of benefits for the environment. So this blue scenario, it shows that optimizing for multiple benefits yields compromise solutions with high benefits at lower costs. In this compromise scenario, if we restore 15% of converted lands in priority areas, which are the highest priority areas in red in the map, we would avoid 60% of expected extinctions and sequester around 300 gigatons of CO2. So this scenario I just showed you is a global unconstrained scenario, which means we are not, is not taking into account the borders, the national borders. So in this scenario, we are able to restore the best places for these three criteria. But this could imply that entire countries would need to be restored, or even entire islands. So this is not ideal or realistic. We also had scenarios for adding other boundaries at the national level. So if we restore 15% of the converted lands within each country, we get 52% increase in costs. It's more expensive, and a reasonable reduction in environmental benefits. So we get less species saved from extinction and less carbon sequestered. And if this is scaled down to the landscape level, so then further down in the graph to the left, you see we get the highest cost. So that would mean restoring 15% of each landscape in the globe. And that will be the highest costs and the poorest solutions for biodiversity and climate. So this shows that the more dispersed restoration yields worse cost-benefit ratios. But it could be that this type of restoration, more dispersed in the landscapes, would provide higher benefits to people. So this is an important next step in the spatial planning for restoration to include, and that's a challenge, to include good information on social benefits apart from costs. But anyways, this trade-off is there, and national and local implementation plans should consider them. So to conclude, restoration is a powerful ally to reverse biodiversity and climate crisis. Spatial planning can increase in 13 times the restoration cost effectiveness, and trade-offs between environmental and social benefits must be accounted for. And it's important to be aware that this type of exercises or this type of spatial planning, it's a tool to support discussions and decision-making. But restoration, the implementation of restoration really happens at the local scale. So it must respect multiple social safeguards, and it must be tailored to local socioeconomic and political context. So this type of spatial planning shouldn't be seen as a prescriptive solution, but rather as a tool to support discussions and try to find the best solutions for each situation. And finally, as a disclaimer, restoration is not rewilding. So landscapes can be restored through sustainable management practices as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Catarina. There were some really thought-provoking and exciting data you were presenting. I'm sure we're going to come back to them in the discussion later on. But we will continue, and I will introduce to you Jean-Marc Kouman, a PhD student from Jean Lourongon Gued University in Côte d'Ivoire. And Jean-Marc is interested in regeneration and restoration in human-impacted tropical forests. So please, Jean-Marc.
Hello, I'm Jean-Marc Kouman, PhD student at Jean Lourongon Gued University of Côte d'Ivoire. My presentation is about natural restoration of the Herlin tropical forest in Côte d'Ivoire, West Africa. Côte d'Ivoire is located in West Africa, has an economic mainly based on cocoa production with 40% of world production. Côte d'Ivoire is the world #1 grain. Forest area, which occupied 24% of the Ivorian territory in 1919, was reduced to 16% in 2000, and this to 11% in 2015. This figure presents the increase of cocoa production and the regression of forest area in the main production region in Côte d'Ivoire. Cocoa farming is the main reason for deforestation in Côte d'Ivoire. One of most typical example is the Rosa classified forest located in west of Côte d'Ivoire. In 2002, the forest class represented by the color green constitutes the landscape matrix of this classified forest. This class has disappeared in favor of the culture class represented in yellow. In 2017, the culture class was the new matrix of this classified landscape. Indeed, the classified forest is, indeed, the classified forest of Rosa Central lost more than 17% of its forest cover between 2002 and to 2012. This situation is much that the government is wondering about the future of the Occidental classified forest. Should the remaining forest be percent of should cocoa production be screened by authorizing the installation of plantation? Some propose to transform of the empty forest into a large cocoa farming, and others advocate a return to a strict protect area with protection planning and appropriate supervision. Before any decision in this important to know if the cessation of agricultural activity in the Occidental classified forest favor the natural recovery of this forest. Slide. So, we study propose to evaluate the potential of natural reconstitution of the vegetation of the classified forest of Occidental after different treatment. Specifically, it will be about to analyze the evolution of tree diversity and determine tree mortality, recruitment, and regeneration potential. To reach the objective, since 2017, floristic inventory has done everything month in the permanent plot. To reach this objective, 12 permanent plots of 2005 as square meter have been installed in horizontal classified forest in the plot in cocoa plantation. All agricultural activity has authority. In 3 over plots, the plantation are not maintained, but the cocoa pods are average, and the 3 have do activity is authority. 3 forest plots are used to control. The quarterly inventory will aim to evaluate the potential of natural reconstitution and vegetation, and to understand the different processes of recolonization. The result of this study indicate that the forests have more species. Cocoa farming with agricultural activity has strong increase in the number of species during this study period. The evolution of mortality indicates that maintained plantation have a extreme mortality. This high mortality is caused by regular weeding and replantation. However, how research have shown a strong recolonization of cocoa farming with agricultural activity by 3. Natural regeneration potential of cocoa farming with agricultural activity is hit in comparison to maintained farming. Indeed, according to Kwesi et al., abandoned cocoa farming have a good capacity for regrowth. What do we hold? Note that despite advanced level of degradation of horizontal classified forests, the lineage species have a high potential of natural regeneration. Horizontal classified forest is able to reconstitute. Recommendation: encourage the natural reconstitution of all horizontal classified forests by removing some agricultural activity, sow and weeding. Involve local population in the restoration and management of the forest areas of horizontal classified forests. Plot monitoring should be continued to understand the natural restoration process and establish vegetation restoration model.
Well, thank you, Jean-Marc, for those, I think, encouraging results of your research. So good luck with your research. And we might come back and ask questions, but there will also be a possibility for you to give answers in writing. So thank you very much, Jean-Marc. And now we'll continue with the next insight into ecological restoration from Sally Torres at Universidad Ricardo Palma. And Sally is an architect with a master's degree in urban planning and policy design. And she has worked with and have interest in urban ecosystem restoration, and also very much in bridging the gap between science, policy, and practice. And Sally will talk about urban planning perspectives on ecosystem restoration in Latin American cities. So please, Sally.
Yes, good morning, everyone. To start, I would like to present the urban planning perspective to the question of ecosystem restoration and MBS in Latin American cities. So I would like to start to mention that MBS are actions inspired by nature that have the potential to turn environmental, social, and economic challenges into novel opportunities. Consequently, several approaches such as ecosystem-based adaptation, green infrastructure, and community-based adaptations took place as a nature-based approaches as a solution. As part of the four principal goals of MBS, restoring degraded ecosystems is one of them because it aims to improve the resilience of the ecosystem to deliver vital ecosystem services, which is a framework to describe multiple relationships between humans and nature while meeting social challenges. In this sense, the urban ecosystems represent a radical transformation of the natural areas. So they have replaced occupying less than 1% of the Earth's land surface, but hosts more than half of its people. In this scenario, the Latin American and Caribbean cities are on the front line of climate change because they represent the highest concentration of biodiversity on the planet. For instance, the metropolitan area of Lima has fragile fog oasis ecosystems located as a green urban age, with an area of 70,000 hectares rich in flora and fauna. And Lomas ecosystems are part of the ecological structure as they constitute green islets in the middle of the desert. Of the 67 Lomas in Peru, 20 are in the metropolitan area of Lima, becoming home to 850 species of vascular plants, of which 215 are endemic species, as well as 352 species of fauna. However, the city's relation with Lomas is incipient. They are progressively degrading and losing themselves due to inappropriate and uncontrolled use of land traffic through informal subdivisions and environmental pollution. The major threat is land trafficking due to corruptions in municipalities that threatens flora and fauna, as well as the well-being of the surrounding populations that continue even if Lomas have a high seismic risk that induces landslides. The pictures show how informal settlements have taken place throughout the last years. So given this unprecedented rise of urbanization, climate change, and environmental crisis are issues whose relevance for climate resilient for developing cities of tomorrow, climate change then could drive to changes in ecosystems, accelerating the loss of the species in the Latin American region, and therefore leading to ecosystem services decrease. Besides, without essentials to meet the need of their citizens, such as access to affordable, secure, and safe housing, basic services, and access to health and education services, due to ineffective urban governance and weak urban planning, the population of these cities are more vulnerable to the climate change. So here rises the need for urban planning and ecosystems integration. In this sense, EVA is a climate change response that uses biodiversity and ecosystem services as part of a broader adaptation strategy. However, there is an emerging issue faced by societies in the capacity of ecosystems to generate these services, such as insufficient public awareness, finance, scientific research, and coordination between legislation and policy instruments across levels of governments. Thus, ecosystem services assessments should be included in urban planning, since land use decisions are made during the process to promote sustainable urban development. The limited research in the Latin American region increases then the crucial need for identifying knowledge gaps in MBS theory and practice, because it is a complex region that needs to develop more studies. And this is not only for its weak environmental governance and socioeconomic inequality issues. Therefore, it's important to acknowledge urban EVA planning and implementation in the Latin American region. And most of the MBS implementations are guided and supported by a network of international organizations, such as the EVA Community of Practice established in the Latin American region with the support of Practical Action and the EVA sub-program of the United Nations Environment. Currently, the European Union and the Brazilian government are working on the implementation of MBS in Brazil. Besides, there are also European Union projects in the Latin American region, such as Connexus in Sao Paulo, Bogota, Santiago, and Buenos Aires, Naturation with initiatives in Mexico City, and the C40 in Bogota, Buenos Aires, Curitiba, Guadalajara, Lima, Medellín, Mexico City, Quito, Rio de Janeiro, Salvador, Santiago, and Sao Paulo. However, other South American countries like Peru and Colombia suffer from limitations in applying MBS. According to the latest research in 2020, some current problems with MBS are the knowledge gaps, the regional development based on economic indicators, social inequalities and poverty, lack of funding or little budget allocation, lack of political support, rigid institutions, and also limited technical capacity. Then, as part of my research in the Lomas ecosystems in Lima, another challenges in urban planning are lack of urban also in development tools and plans, presence of extreme phenomena, incompatibility with policy and legal frameworks, weak environmental culture among inhabitants and institutions, individualism and poor political will, and also corruption. Thus, the question here applies how Latin American and the Caribbean cities can build towards ecosystem restoration through urban planning and EVA integration. There is still insufficient knowledge in MBS integration for adaptation in urban spatial planning, particularly with an integrated and holistic regional landscape. There are many initiatives, but there is a need to join and act under the landscape approach. Thus, there is a need to bring outside the biodiversity into the city, as well as to mitigate the main challenges of policies and knowledge. In this sense, innovation in MBS should also address the interconnectedness and interdependencies between urban and non-urban areas through open space strategies and planning tools to contribute to where and how to apply MBS. Only healthy ecosystems can improve people's livelihoods, counter climate change, and stop the collapse of biodiversity, such as hazard prevention and post-disaster recovery. So EVA needs to be settled in policy based on experience and solid governance to achieve national and global agreements. I need also to develop drivers such as coordination, stakeholders participation, exchange knowledge, and monitoring and evaluation mechanisms. The active integration of academia and scientific institutions are key to direct towards participatory processes, including the community, through commitments that can overcome the changes of authorities across periods of government. Besides, a landscape approach is also needed because today there has been limited research on how diverse forms of natural and urban are valued, as well as the relationship between natural and cultural factors that form a landscape. So preserving, restoring, and improving ecosystems with all the stakeholders is therefore necessary to guarantee livable, sustainable, and resilient cities, a pathway to the future of the Latin American and the Caribbean cities. Thank you very much for your time for this opportunity.
Thank you, Sally, for, I think, rather deep and insightful comments on the challenges in urban regions when it comes to nature-based solutions and ecological restoration. And we're going to continue on this theme of urban also with the next presentation. Dr. Herlin Chien from Taiwan. She has a PhD in political science, but is actually now pursuing a second PhD in sustainability science at the United Nations University in Tokyo, Japan. And Herlin is very much interested in urban aquatic systems and taking a social ecological approach to urban river restoration. So please, Herlin.
Hello, everyone. My name is Herlin Chien. So today I'm presenting a case study of urban river restoration in East Asia, in particular using the Taiwan local case study. So in the global south, especially in Asia, we have an urbanization problems and how the urban dense population can cohabit with the nature ecosystems. For example, in urban rivers, we have a hard time to balance this relationship between the human and nature. And usually we overuse the aquatic river systems. As the picture shows, this Yangtze River in China, and the upstream is still very clean and then natural. But downstream in Shanghai, where it's a mega city, we have severely degraded ecosystem services problems. My study wants to respond to this tragedy of the urban river commons, which is the individual versus collective dilemma, where we have a problem in the degraded system in terms of the drinking water or irrigation, transportation, etc. Next. So my study want to echo the United Nations decades on ecosystem restoration. Hopefully my doctoral dissertation will finish this summer, so I can spend the next 10 years as young scholar to work more on the ecosystem restorations. This urban river project in Taiwan is just a beginning. I want to identify some challenges in the governing of the urban river, two rivers in Taiwan, and then what are some opportunities in the future by using urban commoning actions to help us to make these sustainability transitions. So I did a literature review on the past urban river papers. More than half of them are using a more socio-technical perspective, meaning they focus more on the engineering part or the technical part to restore the river. Only about 6.4% of the paper are from social science backgrounds. As the host mentioned, I have a political science background, and now I'm diving into this sustainability science, and then to see what are some problems of governing the urban river as a common, and especially if I treat the urban river as a social ecological system, because urban river, unlike the river in the rural setting, is usually surrounded by a dense population with a network of complex social, economic, or even political attributes in the setting. So my dissertation suggests that it's best to use this system thinking to understand the holistic dynamic in the urban river governance. So I'm taking this socio-ecological system approach. I want to focus on the fit problem or the misfit problems in the governance. So the two research questions I asked, first one is, what is the socio-ecological fit or misfit that promote or impede the urban river restoration project in my two river empirical case study? Second, I want to figure out what is the recursive, repeated human-nature co-evolution relationship in this restoration project. Next. The picture in the bottom is a man-made wetland in my case study. In my two river, the two local governments use many different wetland system, artificial wetland, to purify the river and then to restore the biodiversity in those rivers. So this is my two case study in the southern Taiwan. One river is longer, about 5.5 kilometer. One is shorter, 5.5 kilometer, and then the other one is longer. So I starting with the shorter one as my pilot study to build my model to collect the data. The two rivers are in two different type of city. One is smaller, one is bigger. The bigger one is where I am now with 2.7 million population. And then the other one is where my university is, where it's in an urban setting, but it's surrounded by a rural area, and they have far more pigs. It has about 1.2 million of pig in the more than 2,000 pig farm. So a lot of agricultural waste pollution into those rivers. The methodology I developed is to adopt a couple infrastructure system framework developed by the Arizona State University. In their couple system framework, they identify 5 different infrastructure that we need to pay attention to, which is hard human-made infrastructure, soft human-made infrastructure, nature infrastructure, human infrastructure, and social infrastructure. By using these 5 different types of infrastructure, enable us to systematically collect my data and then to compare different governing institutes. And then I compare the governing institute against the urban ecosystem services provided by the 2 rivers. These are examples of my proxy indicator. For example, in the hard human-made infrastructure, I use the public sector investment in terms of the money dollar invested in restoring those river. Soft human-made infrastructure is the number of formal rules, law, or regulation. Nature infrastructure is the wetland. Human infrastructure is the number of association, educational facility, or communities devoted to promote the river-related knowledge. And last one, the social infrastructure is number of river-related social events. And then I compare them against, on the right side, the urban ecosystem performance. So those are the 2 river cases. Actually, 2 local government, they use the blue-green infrastructure to purify the urban river, as I mentioned. And they install different number of wetland and then different size of the wetland. This is, I think, the last page. Due to the time, I will not go into detail, but as this finding shows, the 2 rivers, even though they are coming from a very different background, they exhibit very similar human-nature relationship. The green line, meaning that we have a more positive feedback between the users and the infrastructures. And then the red line representing, despite a lot of effort, a lot of infrastructure built by the local government to restore the river, the urban river continued to be degraded, and the river quality was not improved significantly. Even though when we measure the urban ecosystem services are all improved, especially cultural services, there are a lot more events, and then people, the urban population use more the service from the river. So in brief, there are 3 aspects of the socio-ecological misfit that I identify in the study. First one is some missing feedback. As you can see, some line, dash line, those are missing feedback in both cases. Second one is we might have some problem of trade-off, especially between cultural ecosystem services offered while the regulating services might be degraded. The last one is lack of the system resilience strategies. In this model, we have 2 external shocks. When we have external shock in the current system, we don't have enough resilient strategy to adapt to those changes. So this dissertation will hope that we use this system thinking approach to uncover some problem in those governing of the urban rivers. Okay, I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Herlin, for giving us a very detailed and also insightful sort of view of the complexities of urban river restoration, and in particular the social and governance perspectives, and sort of the misfits related to governance of these complex issues. So thank you very much. I think we have with these presentations got quite an exciting overview from the global scale. What is the potential, and down to the local scale and looking at the challenges when you actually try to implement restoration on the local scale. So now we will turn to more of a moderated discussion and conversation. So I want to thank all the presenters very much for your contribution. It's been very valuable. And please stay engaged as well in the continuing discussion. But we have three invited panel members to be part of this discussion. So we have Dr. Lily Zeng from Yale University, and she is from the Yale School of Environment and very much focusing on community-based conservation in sacred forests in China, and particularly in one of the most species-rich areas in China. So Lily combines anthropology and ecology, and very much interested in learning more and analyzing cultural dimension of conservation. And then we have Mirna Fernandez, and she's an environmental, she's been studying environmental engineering, but also fine arts. And she also has a master's in biodiversity and tropical ecosystems. And she's involved in community-based efforts in Bolivia, addressing climate change and sustainable development. And then we have Jessica Cavanagh from Cape Town in South Africa, working with ICLEI and the city's Biodiversity Center. She has a background in climate science, but now working very much with local governments in Africa, particularly looking at how the local governments could work to protect urban natural assets in their cities. And Jessica, through the work of ICLEI, are part of influencing development policies and planning systems in African cities. So welcome the three of you. Maybe I could stop sharing and we'll see the faces. See if that could work. I think that's nicer. So we have Mirna and Jessica and Lily. So welcome. And we have a bit of time to discuss here, and we could also invite maybe the other presenters to that discussion. But I think I want to start with Mirna, and particularly now when this UN decade on ecological restoration is soon to start, like in early June. What are your perspectives and reflections on what would be maybe realistic targets to have reached at the end of the decade? What would perhaps be more aspirational goals? And what would we like to see actually in the global biodiversity framework as a result of negotiations at the COP15 meeting? So please, Mirna.
Thanks a lot, Professor Thomas. And yes, we are entering into the decade on ecosystem restoration. And we also expect to have a target on restoration, actually the first target of the 20 proposed targets as for the draft monitoring framework for the global biodiversity framework that is going to be agreed, is expected to have a target on restoration. By now, it has not been agreed yet because we have a number between brackets as a percentage, but now it's being proposed rather on a target on a percentage. I think that from the experience that we had with the Aichi biodiversity targets, which were the underpinning the previous global strategic framework for biodiversity, we can say that we had a target on restoration. Target 15 was a numerical target aiming for a restoration of 50% of the global degraded ecosystems. And we don't even know if this target has been reached because we don't have enough reporting from the governments. And it is very difficult to assess the effectiveness of the implementation anyway, because we don't know the quality of the outcomes of the restoration plans that were implemented by the governments. And we know from other restoration initiatives that the outcomes can vary a lot. To give you an example, the Bond Challenge has been a very ambitious plan for ecosystem restoration. And an assessment that was published in this scientific journal, Nature, that many of us know, has determined that 46% of the projects that were implemented under the Bond Challenge were related to monoculture plantations. So this is not real restoration, and this doesn't imply benefits for conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. So I think that first, if we want a target that is realistic, but also that will deliver the outcomes that we have, we need to not only focus on the area-based aspects or the percentages of restoration, but we need a target that first focuses on the benefits for biodiversity and ecosystem functions and ecosystem structure, and also has environmental biodiversity safeguards and safeguards for human rights and the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities, because without this, any target implementation won't be real. So I think that's something that we really want to be taken into account in the next framework. And well, the numbers can vary. We had a 50% target for the IG biodiversity targets. That was probably realistic, but if we don't have a proper definition in guidelines for implementation and safeguards, nothing will be really useful.
So are you aware of sort of discussions around the indicators to sort of get away from just estimating area restored to estimate sort of more the quality of restoration? So what would you like to see included in some of the indicators on successful outcome?
Thank you. This is a very interesting question, because right now, for the development of the new framework, we need to only focus on indicators that are already existing. And there are not many existing indicators that focus on the benefits for biodiversity on different ecosystems. Also, we have a lot of indicators on forest restoration, but we don't have many indicators for other kinds of ecosystems, for example, wetlands or coral reefs and other types of ecosystems that need to be restored, because a lot of focus has been put into the carbon sequestration. So I think that I would like to see indicators that focus on other ecosystems and the benefits that are inherent to biodiversity and ecosystem functions. And we do have indicators proposed in terms of connectivity. I think that's something good and something new. And inside indicators, I think that I would like, and everybody in the civil society sphere that works in the CBD processes would like to see safeguards against to respect human rights and for biodiversity. So restoration is not used as an excuse for offsetting or for the delay of the needed decarbonization that we're aiming for.
Thank you. Yeah, I think this is a very important discussion, and often we come up with insights that when we talk about ecological restoration, we perhaps sometimes forget about people. And maybe we should also talk about social ecological restoration, that actually there is an importance to focus on people's perception and relation to nature, particularly if you go from a very degraded state to something that is more functional. And for the long-term function of a system, how people relate to nature is very, very important. So I want to turn to Lily and maybe give your perspective on how can we bring these issues more at the forefront, and that we actually much more are talking about social ecological restoration than just ecological restoration.
Thank you so much for that question, which I think is super important because all these ecological places we're talking about, especially the places that we want to restore, as we've been talking about, like, don't exist in isolation from people. And I don't mean only physically, but also in people's ideas. And so when we're talking about things like restoring people's perceptions and relationships with nature, a really important follow-up question to ask here is whose perception and whose relationship with nature? Are we talking about people living close to nature, or people who have abstract conceptions of nature, but are influencing important political or policy decisions? And the perceptions and relationships here are often very different between these different groups. And there's also important power dynamics at play, because certain groups, usually the ones with more abstract ideas, will be a lot better at mobilizing political will and material resources to protect or restore these particular ideas about what nature is and what nature should be. And then also sort of following this train of thought, the idea that perceptions or relationships with nature need to be restored as part of these larger efforts seems to imply a loss. And I think as part of that work, it's really important to ask ourselves, was a perception or relationship lost, or did something just change? Because I don't have a lot of time, of course, to get into the great details with the scholarship, but there is a lot of work done on how conservation and restoration narratives have evolved over time, especially when we're thinking about Indigenous peoples or local communities. And then in my own work in Southwest China, I've traced how, in the 1980s, encouraging local communities to plant rubber monocultures was seen as a modern way to increase forest cover and reduce ecological damage caused by swidden agriculture from local communities. But then 20 years later, rubber monoculture was seen as very bad by the government and scientific community, while swidden agriculture was seen as something that was sustainable and ecologically friendly. And then so with the shift here, you can see how nothing was necessarily lost. And it was really more about the change in what the dominant political and scientific opinion was. And this sort of shift has actually led to a lot of modern environmentalists doing work in this region, thinking about how they need to restore local communities' connections to nature. But in fact, these relationships, like I said, were actually changed because of these larger scientific and political narratives. So then I guess in terms of thinking, how can we bring these issues to the forefront? Well, of course, having conversations like this one here with many diverse voices is really important, and building enough political and public influence to become incorporated in international, national, subnational policies and programs. That's a very powerful thing. But I think as part of these conversations, it's really important that we're all really self-reflexive, because unfortunately, we've had a history that's shown many cases in which environmental concerns have been leveraged to less admirable ends. And again, there's a large body of scholarship on the politics of environmental governance and unfortunately unintended negative consequences despite seemingly good intentions. And so for instance, in the United States where I've been doing school, national parks actually began with protecting a particular vision of nature that excludes nature, especially Native Americans. And then in 1872, we had an idealized native-free nature that was created with Yellowstone National Park, which is not only one of the first examples of removing a native population for nature, but it's also became a model for national parks around the world. And then even in more recent efforts to be progressive with supporting and affirming Indigenous relationships with nature, such as China's policy vision with the ecological civilization, which draws inspiration for restoration and environmental protection with traditional land uses by Indigenous peoples and ethnic minorities. There are many tensions and unequal power dynamics with who gets to define an appropriate Indigenous relationship to nature. So for instance, there was an Indigenous community I knew that wanted to protect and restore their sacred forest, which was protected for cultural and spiritual reasons. And they wanted to do that through developing for ecotourism. But then this project was blocked by local government because they thought that the Indigenous community had lost their way and they weren't protecting their cultural values and seeking to pursue ecotourism. So you can see here how some of these, there are these contradictions, say with like government and other supports that affirm Indigenous cultures while also not trusting a lot of these Indigenous communities to be responsible stewards of their own culture. So with all these complications and nuances with these social dimensions that we've been talking about, a major aspect to bringing these issues to the forefront is thinking about our own relationships and perceptions of nature as restoration practitioners, conservationists, and environmental advocates. And I think it's really important that we all take some serious thought to unpack, what motivates us and what assumptions we make about people and nature as we set goals and do our work. And also to ask these questions of the partners that we work with and the institutions who support us to do work in ecological restoration and nature-based solutions.
Thank you. You got some you made some very important points there. And I also think this complex issue of people's relationship and perceptions of nature, and also the thinking that climate change in itself will result in that we have to prepare ourselves to adapt, because nature will change, species composition will change, species interactions will change. A lot of things will change with climate change, and so will our relationship and perceptions, and we need to understand that very little is static, and we need to be very adaptive and sort of respond to the changing world that is coming. And that goes for every part of the world. And so maybe when we talk about restoring things, it's not about patterns, it's more like functions and processes that are at the center, because everything else could change over time. So thank you very much for insightful comments on the social and cultural dimensions. I now will turn to Jessica. Jess, hello. So we live in different parts of the world. I'm in Northern Europe, and you in the southern part of the African continent. But we have both experienced during the last year a common pandemic. And one experience and lesson learned in a lot of European cities is that they now come to the insight that there is much more of a need and demand for green space in urban areas. And so there are all these plans being developed for investing in restoring green spaces, or restoring ecosystems, restoring nature in cities. So I'm curious, what's the discussion in African cities in the global south? You might not have been affected in a similar way by the pandemic, but again, the relationship between nature and people in African cities.
Thanks, Thomas. I can only really talk about my experience with a few African cities that I work in. But in these cities, it seems that there are a huge amount of competing needs. And so I wouldn't say that nature is being radically planned, that word radically, or radically restored. But what is happening is it's so much more prominent in the discussions. It's very much at the forefront of people's minds in terms of being part of the remedy, part of the solution to build back better. And cities are really asking for information, and they're asking for research, and they're asking for case studies, and are really reflecting on this more. And what I've personally been witness to is that the project cities that we've been working in under the UNO program for the last 7 years have all really admitted that they are in a much better position because they've had nature as part of their decision making and stuff through the program. So just to provide a bit of background, the UNO program, which stands for Urban Natural Assets for Africa, has been running for 7 years in 8 cities, mainly on the east coast of Africa. And the program has really been about embedding or mainstreaming nature considerations into land use planning and decision making. And that results in on-the-ground interventions. So really implementation, picking up a spade and planting a tree, restoring rivers, restoring wetlands, all the way up to policy reform, practice reform, improving coordination between key actors in the cities. So it's really been an array of activities. And as I've now mentioned, these cities have really said that all of the interventions have prepared them better to be able to deal, and they're in a much better kind of starting block to take action, and have also seen that their communities, their citizens, have also really appreciated the nature in the city over this time, which have been implemented through UNA. So those UNA program cities have really kind of started paving the way or at the forefront of these discussions, where other cities are really saying, we see that nature is so important. We see how critical it is. We want this part of our decision making. We want this part of our dialogue, and looking to these other African cities that now started walking the road, which is really exciting. And another very interesting element of what we're seeing much more is this idea of kind of small community structures. So in African cities, there is a high reliance on your natural asset base for livelihoods. There are more spaces for subsistence, agriculture, permaculture. The services not only provided by nature, but provided by other infrastructures is very close to where people live. And because of these kind of like the nature of these African cities, your communities are having to travel less, they're interacting with less, and the pockets of nature in the city are smaller, but it means that the communities then engaging with those spaces are smaller, so then they spread out. So I think the cities are starting to take kind of lessons learned, that these small structures, these community structures that work together and not this kind of conglomerate of a big city structure is also a very effective way. And nature is wonderful in that, because it can come in its small pockets. You don't need this large kind of park or ecological corridor, as long as there is connectivity. But if you have those small pockets of nature, it's a really effective way at also bringing nature back and allowing this distribution of people, the spread of people throughout the city, that they can connect with their communities close by and not have to travel, not have to interact, which has also been quite profound in slowing the rate of spread. And it's quite a nice thing that is starting to be taken about decision makers of how they can replicate that across other areas of the city.
It sounds like there are so many things happening. And do you have also perspective, what would be the role of youth in Africa in these processes? I just sort of thought of the World Bank published maybe a year ago demographic projection that 2050, a majority of the world's youth will live in Africa. So it's a very young continent. So how do you see the role of youth in driving a transformation?
I mean, I think, yeah, the youth are absolutely critical in terms of driving that thing and the transformation. I think what's kind of been lacking to date from my experience is that the spaces for effective dialogue between the youth and local governments, or youth and national governments, has been a bit lagging. And I think that's also been really exciting at the moment, is the youth coming to the fore and saying, we want to be included in planning, we want to be included in decision making, and local governments listening to that, saying, okay, we need to provide that space. So I think there's a wide recognition that the youth is absolutely critical for that transformation, but how do we effectively build those spaces for that civic dialogue, and that the youth are taken seriously? So it's platforms like this, but also even through the program, is really trying to say your communities need to take ownership of those pockets, and the local governments really need to come to the table and provide that spaces for dialogue. And we're seeing that a lot more, and the youth voice is being taken seriously because of the kind of role that the youth themselves start to recognize, but also the value add that the youth play in decision making and planning future cities, because cities are so dynamic and change rapidly.
Thank you, Jess. Great. So another question, I think, which we've been touched upon, I think also during the presentation, is this, I think also in Catarina's discussion, the trade-off between carbon capture and storage and biodiversity and restoration. So this year we will have the COP15 in October, then we will have COP26 in November, and both conventions will push this idea of using nature to increase the capacity to capture and store carbon. But how do we sort of navigate this in a way that we try to avoid the worst kinds of trade-offs that where carbon just become the sole emphasis, and restoration in most cases end up in large areas of fast-growing monocultures of trees, and so we need the mechanisms to avoid that, and also how do we get sort of local participation in these perhaps massive restoration projects that are about to start. So anyone want to give comment? And also from the panelists, maybe Catarina, you would also have maybe some views on this.
I can go first, Thomas. Just a short question about that is, we've been spending. I mean, you know, you can talk about action, you can talk about things, but the real crux of it is that if there's no finances dedicated, then you are going to be struggling. So we've been spending a huge amount of time trying to get our local governments and their communities, their constituents, to be able to be in a better position to access that finance, climate finance, around. And so we've been supporting our cities developing concept notes and pre-feasibility studies, and all of those kind of things look at a cross-cutting, holistic avenue to ecological restoration. So it's not just about carbon, it brings in livelihoods, it brings in how many jobs can be created, it brings in that social element, brings in the youth. And so what we're currently doing is we're building these templates to support local governments being able to kind of do a bankability scorecard that they are touching on all the SDGs and are really kind of trying to have this holistic approach. So that's a very quick answer, is supporting this kind of, as you rightly mentioned earlier, it's sometimes about processes and procedures and systems, not just about the outputs. And so trying to provide better processes that touch on many different things. And so templates are being developed, that these restoration projects are not just solely about carbon. That's just my 2 cents.
Good comment. Anyone else have comment? Catarina or Mirna? Or
yeah, I may add a comment. Yeah, I think that there is a danger there indeed of this high focus on carbon, and you will end up prioritizing forests over grasslands, for example, for restoration, which is really not what we want. So I believe a multi-criteria approach should be used, and then the funding agencies and the government should also be aware of the important criteria that should be included. In forests, you can get some synergies between carbon and biodiversity, but in other ecosystems, biodiversity would be a much more important benefit, and in other situations, other social aspects would be also really important. So I think it's very difficult to have a unique solution, but yeah, I would say that multi-criteria would be, it's an important aspect to be taken into account, and also to look at different ecosystems and not expecting restoration to happen under the same pressure or forces everywhere, but then you may need to have different strategies, and we will have to need different strategies for different ecosystems, different biomes.
Yeah, if I can add to that, I very much agree with what Catarina has said. There are many risks already, so we need the global policy to address them properly. We have published with the Global Youth Biodiversity Framework Network and Yango and Youth for Nature, which are 3 youth constituencies that work in global policy on environmental issues. An information brief, a joint information brief on nature-based solutions, for example, where we are pointing the concerns raised by civil society, the risks that the concept implies, and the implementation and the needed safeguards that we would need to advocate for as youth constituencies. I think that biodiversity and social safeguards are the most important points that we need to raise when these terms of restoration and nature-based solutions are developed in these frameworks. But also the very concepts of these are not really defined. For example, in the Global Biodiversity Framework, we don't have an agreed definition and standards for nature-based solutions, but it is already in the monitoring framework drafts. So it is a risk because it is at the same level as the ecosystem approach. We have targets that mention implementation of nature-based solutions and the ecosystem approach, but the ecosystem approach has already been defined and in the CBD. And we have 12 Malawi principles, they are called like that, and they touch on very specific aspects as the ecosystem's integrity and structure and functions and the safeguards for local people and these aspects that are really important. While we don't have a formal definition, we don't have safeguards, we don't have principles, or nothing agreed under the CBD. We know that there are very good initiatives to develop this kind of standards. For example, the IUCN standards that are global standards for nature-based solutions are something very interesting to look at. But if we don't have that defined and agreed in the CBD or in the UNFCCC, then we're facing a huge risk that it can lead to the wrong kind of restoration or nature-based solutions. So this is already going on. Like Shell, for example, has a nature-based solutions plan, and it's very focused on offsetting, right? So we really need these definitions and standards in the global policy to ensure that it doesn't go the wrong way.
Yeah, I could just mention what's happening in the European Union, that the European Commission now has a very ambitious plan when it comes to restoration as part of the farm to fork strategy and well, all over the Green Deal, as they call the farm to fork strategy, biodiversity strategy, and a new forest strategy as well. And they are pushing a lot of new ideas around financial mechanisms and incentives around what they call carbon farming, which is actually farmers managing the landscape for carbon rather than producing something else. But I see a great, as we pointed out, there's a great risk unless you have good concepts and good mechanisms in place, that the carbon market will drive this too far, too much into sort of a monoculture type of activity. And we need to avoid that by all means. So we need also a global dialogue around these issues. So very much. And hopefully CBD could provide one and sort of guiding direction for that. So I think I will open the floor to anyone from the panel or presenters that you want to raise something that you think is relevant, or something that came up during the presentations you want to emphasize a bit more. I've been looking through the questions in the Q&A, and it seems like quite a few of them been answered already, but I will keep looking. But please, the floor is open for anyone to make further comments or interventions.
May I have a question? I have a question to, I don't know who wants to answer. And that's actually a question that is posted, and I think it's very relevant on how to include traditional communities and local people in this restoration planning and action, because I work more on the biophysical aspects of restoration, and I see that the restoration science doesn't take much into account the local knowledge for even the technology of restoration, how to restore, which species to restore. And I think we are missing a lot there. Local communities, traditional communities, indigenous people, they have a wide knowledge on how to manage their ecosystems, and they could help a lot with improving restoration techniques. And I wonder, how are they being invited to the discussion on the restoration in the moment of implementing? So I don't know if someone would like to comment on that.
If I could just comment, thank you so much for the question. If I could just comment quickly, I was just thinking, so I guess in my line of work now as an anthropologist, in terms of reaching out, of course, we want to form these partnerships and include like local indigenous communities in decision making. But I'd also say like a pattern that kind of happens also is in terms of like when we predefine some of our environmental or restoration goals, we choose who we work with, right? So I've seen a lot of, I guess, indigenous communities whose like goals don't fit necessarily with, you know, say like me as like an international outside like expert kind of person coming in, or with government agendas, you know, like what they view as restoration goals and things like that. Like the power dynamic is such that they aren't prioritized. And so even though their inclusion is sort of like, check, we talk to them, like their thoughts aren't really brought in like a really meaningful way to shape how work is done. And so I think that in terms of work going forward and including people meaningfully, it's really important to, again, like I was being really self-reflexive, thinking really hard and say like this international work or government supported work and all these like bigger programs and policies and local initiatives too, just like really bringing people in at like a meaningful stage early on so we can help shape what it means and being open to expanding it beyond what our initial definitions were. So for instance, early on when I was asking people, it's like, what is biodiversity to you? Like biodiversity as a category doesn't exist in the same way for all the people that you are trying to work with. You know, so even something as basic as these definitions, like what is the restoration target? You know, what are the goals after restoration? Like these are all really like shared objectives we need to sort of think about early on and meaningfully. So I also see a hand up, so I don't want to steal all the floor.
Anyone else want to comment? Mirna, you have maybe some, or Jess?
I mean, I think Lily put it perfectly. I think a little thing about what her key point about power dynamics. So we spend a huge amount of time doing that, is bringing the indigenous and the youth and the local community and the making sure there's a gender balance and all the right stuff in a room. But even when you get them in a room, there's still tension and there's still uncertainty and voices being raised, and then uncertainty about who can say what and all the rest of it. So what we have just tried to do is really design and spend a huge amount of time designing those co-production knowledge generation processes. So we kind of call our method like experiential games. So we've got these various things. So for example, we had a 3-hour workshop where all the mayors plus the local communities were playing with beans. They, you know, those beans that like stamp and stuff that you think, and it was about resource allocation and using beans and then trading with the communities and all this. So you're literally playing a game, and it's a 3-hour discussion. And what comes out of that is just brilliant, because you don't feel like you're in a room. You don't feel like you are engaging as a mayor versus a local community. You just meeting as a human being, and that was really, really great. And so we kind of prioritize designing effective processes to ensure that those power dynamics, those gender dynamics and all the rest are really taken into account. And I can share some links as well in some of these experiential methods that we've been developing, and those have proved really, really effective. But I think it's just acknowledging that there's power in a room and how do you overcome that, and making the space for everybody to meet on a natural platform.
I can also add that 2 points that are for me super important for this are first, the free, prior, and informed consent. That is a principle that should be applied in any development and in the implementation of any project, even if it is a restoration project, and if there is like a certainty that it will bring benefits to the local people, it doesn't mean that this principle can be avoided. So I think that it's important to remind implementers that the principle of free, prior, and informed consent to indigenous peoples and local communities has to be applied in any case. And second, I think that it's very important, specifically on the field of research, as Catarina mentioned it, the effective support, not only the recognition of the traditional knowledge role in ecological restoration, but also the support of this with financial support or with other means of support for the people that holds this knowledge. I have been lucky to do my bachelor's thesis with a traditional knowledge on peat box restoration with indigenous communities. And they weren't when I traveled and worked with these indigenous communities, they were already reluctant to share the knowledge that they have on this because they had a wide knowledge on this, but they have a lot of people that, like researchers or biologists that take their information and they do publications without citing them, without putting their names, and they even use their pictures. They leave cameras to them. They make them like report with pictures, and they don't even cite the source of the photographs. So that is really important, because if you lose this knowledge because the people is reluctant to cooperate anymore, then you lose years and years of knowledge, because it's totally different to send a researcher for 6 months and try to sample the ecosystem and see what's going on, than the community that lives there and knows. For example, in the peat bog's case, they realize that there are 7 years cycles when the peat bog dries up and then gains water again and these things, but they were observing the peat bog for years, for generations. So they had a wider understanding of how the dynamics of the ecosystem functions and how this can be restored. So I think it's crucial to maintain this knowledge and support it and empower the people that hold this knowledge, so they can also take an active role in ecosystem restoration.
Well, thank you. And I think you made an excellent point at the end here, the importance of building trust. And I think that's maybe the cornerstone of all success, to be able to build trust among different interest groups and stakeholders. And so we'll keep that in mind. And I want to thank all of you presenters and panelists for a very fruitful discussion. And I think we're going to generate quite some exciting key messages, which will be then presented to Substa and SBI and be part of the discussion at the COP meeting